Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, wherever you are. Good morning, Ray, in the UK. Okay, I just want to say a little bit of background about myself. So as Sue said, I'm just wrapping up my PhD in marketing. In fact, tomorrow I'm graduating. My research area is in perceived self-transparency of individuals in workplaces and customers as well, which links in with social desirability effects and how that impacts the bias in our data. And the type of methodology and analysis that I've used throughout the years in research is structural equation modeling. I've designed surveys, and also I'm into experimental laboratory designs. So today I'm going to be talking to you about common method variance. Sorry, so I can't seem to control the screen. Oh, here we go. Okay, so there are three contents in what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to be talking about what is common method variance, what are the sources of common method variance, and what you can do to alleviate common method variance. So before I start talking about what is common method variance, I just want to talk to you about how it is linked to bias and what I mean by bias and why bias is so important for us to reduce or minimize. As Ray mentioned earlier, we can't remove it. It's always going to be there, but we can do a lot of things to be able to reduce it in terms of the way we design our questionnaires. So in essence, bias is when our data misrepresents the reality, and then the problem with this is that we might make the wrong decisions, or to go ahead with the project when we shouldn't be, or to launch a product when we shouldn't be, or to sell, to produce a lot of something when we shouldn't be, or otherwise make the wrong decision, really. Okay, so what is common method variance? Sorry about this, I'm having technical. What is common method variance? In academia, common method variance has been quite a hot topic of late because it relates to the level of bias. That it really reflects the degree of bias that you could in the data. We statistically measure the degree of bias in our data. So it's a systematic error variance, or the amount of spurious covariance shared amongst variables because of the common method used in collecting data. And what we mean by that is that the type of bias we measure based on either a self-reported data or data that is reported as a part of an observation by another person. So the consequences of high level of common method variance is that it can either deflate or inflate the empirical estimates of the true relationship between two variables or constructs. So if that happens, then you are more likely, that leads to inappropriate rejection of what we think is the true relationship of something, how we feel that how the real world operates, and it also threatens the validity of our measurement scale. So we might think that it's highly reliable when in fact it's not, and we shouldn't be using that data at all. So, and the bias arises based on the type of survey instrument that we use, on the way that we've designed it, and also it arises from the mode of administration. So whether you've executed your data on based on paper survey, or online survey, telephone survey, or some other means. So why should industry practitioners care about common method variance and not just academics? We care about correlation accuracies between variables, especially if you're using a lot of psychometric measures in your studies, because that represents the true. You want to make sure that your data is a representative of reality or the real world, and also you want to encourage your respondents to give the most accurate and honest answer as they can, instead of giving you inaccurate picture of what the reality is. In academic research in the past 5-10 years or so, a lot of academics found that almost 30% of the variation observed in social science, the problem that the bias comes from this thing called common method variance. And that identifying the degree of common method variance is important because we find out the true representation of the relationship between two variables or more variables. So it really helps us to identify what is the real relationship between these variables and how have we actually reflected the real world. And if we don't statistically identify these things, then and adjust the value of our data by reducing the variance, then we are going to end up reporting unreal relationships. So I just thought I'd give you an example of what I mean by common method variance. Pardon me if I'm using too much of an academic terminology here. So for example, if your boss tells you, all right, go and do this NewMR webinar because I feel that it's going to increase your workplace loyalty. So your boss is hypothesizing that higher enjoyment in the work training, which is the NewMR webinar, leads to workplace loyalty. So we have two constructs here. It's the enjoyment and workplace loyalty. So here's the relationship. So we're saying that there's a positive relationship between these two constructs. In a situation where there is a high level of common method variance or high degree of bias, our results might tell us the opposite of our hypothesis, and we might get the value of negative 0.65. And if we don't detect whether there is common method variance in our data or not, we might end up rejecting this hypothesis and say, oh, well, enjoyment in work training doesn't really increase workplace loyalty. But after detecting and adjusting the correlations, after detecting common method variance and adjusting the data, the true relationship between the two constructs is in fact a positive relationship, which is 0.55. So your boss is right that you really should go and do this training, this NewMR webinar, because it increases your workplace loyalty. Not only that, you get your time off and you can sit back and have your cup of coffee and donut in this lovely afternoon. So there you go, increases your workplace loyalty. So that's why some bosses might feel to encourage their staff to do so. So what are the sources of common method variance? There are three major sources of common method variance. There's the social desirability effect. These things influence a person's way of responding to the questionnaire. So they want to look cool, they want to look good, they want to conform socially to the people around them. They might guess who is going to be looking or reading at the responses. So they don't want to be transparent. They wouldn't want to be fully open about how they truly feel. And this can be problematic if we're doing research in the areas of health, for example. The ambiguous wording of our questionnaire is that this is why it's very important in our pre-testing that we ensure that we don't put things there that are very difficult to understand, especially if we live in a multicultural society like Australia and the UK, and also the scale length. You don't want to make it too short to the point that the respondent might think, well, this research doesn't really mean anything. That's why there's not enough questions there, so I'll just give them whatever. You don't want to make it too long because they're going to get bored. So in essence, common method variance really arises when there's a mood change or change of attitude and emotions from the respondent's end. And that kind of change in emotions and attitude affects or changes the way that they actually respond to our questionnaire, and that increases the likelihood of bias. The sources of common method variance or bias in our studies have been discussed by Ray a little bit earlier. So here, the first category is what we call in academia the common rater effects. Common rater effects arises when the questionnaire brings changes in the respondent's mood or cognitive processing. So these things, as Ray basically talked about earlier, when everybody tend to agree to all the questions. It might be because your scale has agree on the left or on the right. It might be because of the way that you have of the layout of your questionnaire. In Acquiescence bias also means that your respondents might give extreme responses. So, in the first 5 questions, they might completely agree with the questions, and then on the second half of your questions, they might completely disagree just because they feel really irritated or something like that, because the questionnaire is becoming too long, or the person asking the question might be a little bit boring or something like that. So they give extreme responses, so you have to watch out for these things. The second category are more related to the content or the written content on the survey instrument. So the item demand characteristics. Are you asking your respondents to reveal something that is extremely sensitive to them, reveal something that they probably wouldn't reveal? And if you are, is paper-based survey the right way to go about it, or should you do a phone survey? Item context effects, so that once again goes back to what Ray was talking about, the way you design your scale. You're going to have the agree bit on the left side or on the right side, neither agree or disagree. And that part there itself confuses a lot of respondents because it doesn't reflect reality. Nobody answers, I neither agree or disagree. And then the measurement context effect. Some people cannot comprehend the scale of 1 to 7, or so you might want to be, you might want to include wording on your scale so that they can see, yep, I completely agree, I completely disagree, instead of asking them in the scale of 1 to 7, 1 being completely disagree and 7 being completely agree. How much do you agree with this sentence? So some people don't at all comprehend that kind of measurement. And these kind of things in your questionnaire can induce response style bias. So so people might end up over-reporting things that are very that are socially desirable to make themselves look good, or they might under-report things that are socially undesirable. So once again, this kind of response style bias is really reflecting on the inaccuracy or the lack of transparency from the respondents, and we don't want that, because if we do get that, then we're going to end up having poor data quality. It's not a reflector of the real world. Okay. So in terms of our measurement instrument, when we do I highly recommend that you do pre-test. A lot of companies obviously do pre-test. These things are what you should be looking out for. So number one is you should be checking for the sensitivity of your questions, because sensitive questions can lead to systematic misreporting, and that relates to the transparency of the individual that's responding to your research, and that's also linked with social desirability. If you ask something that's extremely sensitive, it may be culturally or religiously or something to do with health, and they don't want to reveal it, they don't want to seem transparent, then that can have impact on what they report. And if you find that it's really, really necessary for you to ask these sensitive questions, you might want to consider or find out which is the best mode or method to execute this research. So should I go and do this research online, face-to-face? Should I ask an interpreter to do this for me? Or should I actually, ask somebody else who knows this person to actually do the questions for the survey for me? And then the second one is the length of questionnaire and the order of questions. So as I said earlier, you don't want to make it too short, because if the questionnaire is too short, respondents are highly likely going to think your research is not worth anything. It doesn't have any impact, so there's no point in giving you attention that you deserve, because the questionnaire is quite short. But if it's too long, it's going to bore them. So a lot of research also found in academia that the longer the questionnaire, the more issue of social desirability, because if you have so many questions there, the respondents are going to feel, oh my gosh, this survey is really being intrusive. I feel like I'm revealing all of me. I better make myself look great in front of the people who are going to be reading my responses. So they're going to end up skewing their data to make themselves look really, really good. The second part is the mode of administration. The way that you execute your data can also induce bias in your research. So one option is paper-based, a traditional option is paper-based. So you need to look for check for the visual design, the effects of your visual design. So I suggest, a lot of researchers suggest that to use neutral colors if you're going to be using a paper-based design. Because if you use colored paper, some people don't like colors, the color green or brown and things like that, and that can have an impact on their mood, on their attitude, and it's going to highly likely induce bias in the way that they respond. The biggest thing is to limit your visual stimulus. I've seen a lot of research out there with lots of photos, although it makes the survey questionnaire look nice and pretty and so much fun, but these kind of stimulus can also change mood and behavior. So if you're going to be doing a research on depression, you wouldn't want to put something funny there because you're not going to be able to capture their emotional state of depression if you want them to report on how they truly feel when they're depressed. So you don't want to change that state of emotion. So the second thing is it's online research. A lot of us are going online these days because it's cost effective. We get our data really quickly, and also we get to capture a bigger audience using online. So when online research began about 15 years ago, the biggest factor is to consider the screen size, because when you're designing your questionnaire, so because in those days people either used laptop or they use desktop. So now these days you need to consider people answering your questionnaire via iPhone, iPad. So in my research, and a couple of people I know in the United States and also in Germany found that people who use iPads and iPhones are more likely to experience social desirability pressure on them, on the way that they respond the questionnaire, because they may be responding to the questionnaire in front of their friends, or they might be somewhere out there where people can actually see how they're responding. And also the fact that you need to consider the real life into your questionnaire. The configuration, so ensure that your questionnaire is compatible with a lot of the operating system, may it be Apple or BlackBerry, and the hardware used by respondents. So the second point here with online research is the design choices. Once again, it's the ordering of questions. Put your most important question first, the heart of your studies in the very beginning. But if your questions are extremely sensitive, try to put that somewhere in the middle. Because you don't, as I said, you don't want to be changing their moods in the very beginning. You want to keep it as is or as neutral as possible. And the layout of your questionnaire is also extremely important. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit shortly. And that is related to the way that you group and how many items that you have on your screen. The more the items you have on your screen, the more you're likely to have this correlation bias. Because if people can guess that, this one construct and the other construct must be positively related, or somebody might be saying, oh yeah, it looks like they're hypothesizing that A increases B, then that's going to drive the way that they respond to your questionnaire. So watch out for how many items you have and what kind of constructs you put into your screen, because that's also going to be driving your bias or correlation bias. So studies in the United States and also in Europe has shown that correlations are higher for items that appear together on the screen than among items that are separated across several screens. And these are recent studies in the past 6 years. And there are more studies that are looking into whether we should look at whether we should just put one scale on each screen to reduce this kind of correlation bias or illusory bias when we do online, or we should still pretend that it's kind of a paper-based type of research where people see everything in one page. Okay, I'll give you an example of what I mean by this illusory bias or correlational bias in online research. So here we have two scales in one screen. So earlier on we've hypothesized that the higher the enjoyment in work training, such as attending a webinar like this, the more loyalty that they will, the more workplace loyalty there is. So here you were showing the scales for both constructs on the same screen. So what research has found is that if you do this kind of stuff, then you're going to end up inflating the correlation between these two items, and you're not going to be representing what is really the true relationship between these two, because there's a high probability or possibility that the respondents are going to guess the relationship that you're trying to measure, and that drives the way that they respond. A lot of academics actually favor this type of design where you only have one scale or one construct psychometric scale on your screen, because this keeps the respondents in focus. It's hard enough when they can see all of these items on these 4 items on their screen and feel, oh, they're repeating. That also drives the bias on their response bias. But imagine if they have 3 or 4 constructs on the same screen, that's going to drive them even more crazier, and that leads to more bias. So if we compare the correlations between the two types of design, so the first design we have that I've shown you, there's 2 scales in one screen. The output there is 0.76. The correlation coefficient that we get is 0.76. And although it is significant, it's still quite high in comparison to when we test the relationship between enjoyment and workplace loyalty with one item scale on screen, and the result is 0.55. So you can see there's a big difference there in the way that reality is represented, just because we have one item scale, one scale in one screen versus 2 scales in one screen. So watch out for these things when you actually do your online studies. The third thing, which is really big in social science research, is telephone interviews, and this is something that we don't really do much in academia because it's incredibly expensive, and also we don't have the facilities for it. But telephone interviews is so important, and there's a lot of bias there because there's this the interview is 3-dimensional. You hear the voice of the interviewer, you feel you can somehow feel their tiredness, their emotions. That impacts on the respondents because of this thing we call emotional contagion. So one of the first things that we found, that some of the studies, well, I didn't do the telephone interview study, is the social cultural impact of interviewers. Some market research firm outsource their interviewers from another country, and sometimes respondents in, for example, in Australia or in the UK and also in America would get frustrated because there's this disconnect, there's this cultural gap, so they can't express themselves accordingly, and that drives the way that the respondent gives an answer. They get frustrated, so they just end up going, yeah, agree, agree, agree. So there's that presence of acquiescence bias. But then, of course, you don't. But then, of course, there's also this thing where the respondent and the interviewer might be coming from a similar culture where transparency, individual transparency, is highly, highly regarded, highly important. Where expressing emotion, expressing your lackingness is not accepted. So that also drives the way that they respond in telephone interviews. So this usually comes from Eastern cultures. So this is problematic. So watch out when you're doing interviews with people who are from Eastern cultures. The mode effect is really big at the moment. This is why we have this thing called the dual frame methodology studies going on in the US, in Germany, and Australia. So the respondents, you might want to consider in your survey 1 or 2 questions to ask the respondents whether they're responding to your survey at home or whether they're somewhere else. Because if they're at home and they're by themselves, there's highly likelihood that they would feel comfortable telling you how they truly feel because there's nobody there to influence them. But they're somewhere else where there's a lot of noise that can frustrate them, or they might be in front of someone they're trying to impress. That's going to also lead to bias. So watch out for these with mobile respondents as well as landline respondents, because if they have a lot of their friends around them or their mother or father, they're probably going to be a different person when someone's there. So I recommend that you actually consider adding 1 or 2 questions in your survey to check whether there is a any social desirability effect in your data, to find out whether your respondents are actually skewing their answers because somebody there is someone is present. And the third thing is the respondent familiarity with interviewers or the company. So if you are doing longitudinal studies, it is not recommended that you have the same interviewer to call. It's not recommended that you actually designate the same interviewer to the same respondent, because they start to develop some kind of open boundary relationship, which becomes dangerous because that also increases the level of bias. So if they become close friends, they might be too open, or they might try to impress each other. So the respondent might try to impress the interviewer. And the last thing is the type. How do you statistically detect common method variance? There are 3 popular ways of statistically testing for common method variance. The most popular one is Harmon's common factor. We conduct that using exploratory factor analysis through SPSS or some other means, R or whatever. And with this Harmon's common factor, you basically load all of your constructs, and then you rotate them as one factor, and if your one factor can explain above 0.5 of the variance in your data, then you're in trouble. There's a high level of bias in your data. The most popular one and the hottest technique in academia and also in America in industry is this thing called the marker variable technique, and that's inserting a variable or a construct that's not theoretically related to your to any of the construct or relationship that you're actually studying. The problem with this is that it adds more questions. It lengthens your questionnaire, which defeats the purpose of reducing bias. But this is the best and the most highly recommended at the moment, because this way you can actually test whether the person has paid attention to your questionnaire. That's basically all of my my presentation today. Thank you so much for the opportunity and listening in to me. And if you have any questions, you can either follow me on Twitter or question away. Thank you.